Okay, this will be the chapter summary for consumer behavior for chapter 4. Chapter 4, the changing American society. We're still looking at external influencers on our buying behavior, but mainly looking at demographics and social stratification with chapter 4. Social stratification is just a fancy word for social class, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But with chapter 4, some definitions to start things out. Again, I always look at the outlines as I'm moving through. Looking at some demographic definitions, but knowing how the U.S. population has changed demographically, population size, occupation, education, income, age, and how those things influence our buying behavior. Our occupation. The CEO of the company does not eat the same lunch as the laborer down on the assembly line. That definitely, our occupation influences our consumption. Our education. We say that we've gone through here in the United States degree inflation. Folks are getting higher and higher degrees because of the requirements of jobs that are out there, et cetera, and how that influences what we buy. Income, age, things of that nature. So just kind of looking at those things. Then looking at some different generations here in the United States, starting with the pre-Depression generation, which there aren't a lot of those folks left. And then the Depression generation, those would be the ones born during before the World War II, from the 20s through the 40s. And then the baby boomers, which is that large bulge in our population, a large population explosion growth there, high birth rate from the end of World War II through the 1960s. Then in the 70s and early 80s, we had Generation X, those folks being born. Generation Y would be 80s and 90s. And then today, right before the year 2000, the late 90s, and then into the 2000s, we have the millennials. Now, that generation has lots of different names. Tweens, the tweeners, the millennials, the net generation, Generation Z, etc. Knowing a little bit about those generations helps marketing managers and those generations. It does influence our buying behavior. The textbook, the authors do a very good job of explaining those different generations. Then we get into social class or social stratification. There's something that's not in the textbook, Roman numeral 3 of the outline. The criteria for a good social class system or a tight social class system in a culture. There are 5 basic criteria for a tight or good social class system, and those would be, is it bounded? Is it ordered? Is it mutually exclusive, exhaustive, and influential? Bounded in that you have distinct breaks where one class begins, lower class is no income up to 20,000. Something like that. That would be bounded. Ordered, there's distinct order, lower, middle, and upper class. Mutually exclusive, you can only belong to one class. If you're in the lower class, you can only be in the lower class on all the dimensions used to put you in a class. You couldn't belong to multiple classes at one time. Exhaustive, everyone in society should be able to be put in one of the classes. And then influential, that the classes are large enough or distinct enough that they do show distinctive behavior. In the United States, our lower, middle, and upper class system does meet this criteria, except for the first one, bounded. We don't have clear breaks on where one class ends and the next class begins, but we definitely have a lower, middle, and upper class. Status crystallization is a term that's significant there. That's in the textbook. And then a description of how we are put into our classes in the United States. Most of the time we use a functional approach where we look at the top 3 are income, occupation, and education, looking at someone's degree, their income levels, things like that to determine what class they're in. Income is probably the most significant one. If we're going to use a single item index to put someone in a social class, we'll use income, but we can also, in the United States, we couple it with education and occupation with that. And we have a significant breakdown there in the social structure in the United States with lower class, and the lower class make up the lower class, lower Americans. And then in the middle Americans, the middle class, you've got the working class, middle class, and upper middle class. And then, of course, the upper class would be the lower upper and the upper. And there's a description of each one of those and how their buying behaviors differ. And that, pretty much, explains and, walks through the different social class systems, the social class system we have in the United States. The chapter does finish out with looking at how we can do that, how it's put together. The most common one used is the U.S. Census Bureau's breakdown, and that's the one that uses education, occupation, and income. And that pretty much covers chapter 4.